Welcome to the first lesson in the ADAPT Institute's Leadership in Complex Environments course. This course provides an introduction to the systems literacy and leadership competencies found in the Next Generation Core Competencies for Emergency Management Professionals framework through exploring how leaders can position themselves and their organizations, departments, or teams to function effectively when confronted with uncertainty and continual change. The lesson begins by asking the enormous question of what is complexity, that it then attempts to answer through the exploration of the notion of systems. Hit pause at any point during the lesson to spend more time reading the content on each slide. Press pause now to read an important excerpt from Nassim Taleb's book, The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable. Press pause again to read a similar quote from Robert Chia and Robin Holt's book titled Strategy Without Design: The Silent Efficacy of Indirect Action. Platonicity and neatness are similar concepts that will be collectively referred to as neatness. Neatness, or rather the desire for neatness, can be found throughout daily life. For example, neatness is often pervasive throughout organizations. The clear lines of communication, coordination, command, and control of the standard hierarchical organization chart provide an unmistakably neat, orderly, and predictable approach to work. Detailed procedures dictating how work is to be completed and 5-year plans designed around predetermined objectives also have an impetus toward neatness. The roots of the common impetus toward neatness, as it has been discussed here, can be traced back to the scientific revolution, when a marked shift in how the world was understood took place, flowing from the work of prominent figures such as René Descartes, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and Nicholas Copernicus. Through their work, the world came to be seen as a machine filled with machines, all governed by laws in a predictable manner. René Descartes is quoted as having said, "I do not recognize any difference between the machines made by craftsmen and the various bodies that nature alone composes." From the mechanistic view of the world, the universe itself was thought to be completely knowable, and relationships between cause and effect were considered to be linear or proportionate and close in space and time. If causal relationships were understood in enough detail, the future could be predicted with certainty. Closely related to neatness is analysis. In the words of the theoretical physicist Fritjof Capra, analysis means taking something apart in order to understand it. Analysis is a reductionist approach, meaning it seeks to break things apart into smaller and smaller pieces to be studied separately, in order to gain an understanding of the original whole, or to optimize one of the isolated pieces in an effort to optimize the whole. In the words of Russell Ackoff, reductionism is the belief that all reality of our experience can be reduced to ultimate, indivisible elements. Analysis and reductionism will be returned to later in the course. By now, the pervasiveness of neatness and a rough sketch of its historical foundations should be visible. Neatness can now be understood as a desire or effort to seek and maintain order. As it is typically used, the word order refers to a recognizable and generally established pattern or arrangement of people and processes during some activity. As noted earlier, neatness has and continues to permeate organizational life. The foundations of dominant, contemporary, Western thought, established by Newton, Descartes, and others, continue to shape how organizations are designed, managed, and led. Bureaucratic organizations seek to maintain and establish neatness, a clearly understood and communicated order upheld by straight vertical lines of communication, command, and control. In many ways, Contemporary organizational management is based around the notion of the machine that was central to the thought of Newton and Descartes. In certain environments, as Donaldson, Ackoff, and Morgan note, constraining bureaucratic structures can be effective. However, as noted in the earlier quotes by Taleb, Chia, and Hult, when assumptions of neatness encounter the messiness and unpredictability often found in the world, a gap between how the world was assumed to exist and how it is found to exist appears. Perhaps more problematic than the meeting of neat structures with a messy world is the transferring of the assumptions of neatness underlying the structures we design and work within to the world around us. In projecting familiar neatness onto the world may then appear to be predictable, ordered, completely understandable, and comprised of disparate things and events that can be managed toward predetermined outcomes. Contemporary science suggests this simplistic view fails to recognize and take into account the unavoidable and irreducible messiness, the complexity of the world as it has actually been found to exist. A great many works in a number of fields, including emergency management and homeland security, have highlighted the necessity of developing professionals and practices that recognize and seek to effectively address the world's true complex messiness, instead of working to reduce it through the establishment and maintenance of order. Within these works, significant attention is often placed on the value of understanding and addressing complexity when working with complex, wicked, and open problems that cannot be simplified and broken up into smaller pieces through a reductionist analysis. Fortunately, a wealth of literature suggests the gap between how the world is often approached and how it is found to truly exist can be decreased through the study of systems.
The term system has come to have a number of different meanings in a variety of different contexts. As it is being used here and in many of the narratives used in this course, including systems thinking and complex adaptive systems, a system has been defined as an integrated whole whose essential properties arise from the relationship between its parts. Similarly, Peter Checkland, a management scientist, suggests the term system embodies the idea of a set of elements connected together which form a whole, this showing properties which are properties of the whole rather than properties of its component parts. The definitions provided here can be connected and summarized by the frequently used phrase, a system is a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. But what exactly does it mean for something to be more than the sum of its parts?
The phrase "more than the sum of its parts" refers to what are known as emergent properties. Emergent properties are created through the interactions and interrelationships among the parts of the system. For example, the taste of sugar is not found in sugars constituted of hydrogen, carbon, or oxygen atoms. It exists only at the level of the sugar molecule as an emergent property created through the interrelationships among the parts, the atoms. In other words, emergent properties are created through the relationships among the parts of a system. Emergent properties extend far beyond taste. For example, the red color of an apple, life, the identity of a football team, and community dynamics can be considered emergent properties, as can a community's behavior, culture, and trust among its members. Emergent properties arise through the relationships among the parts of a system. Pause here to read a brief quote from Russell Ackoff that brings together the notion of system with emergent properties while hinting at the problematic nature of analysis when it is used to study systems. It has been discovered that order itself can be an emergent property. As explained earlier, the word order refers to a recognizable and generally established pattern or arrangement of people and processes during some activity. Order arises as an emergent property through the interaction of some or all of the system's parts. Typically, order is established and maintained in organizations through the design of organizational charts, procedures, and policies. In other words, organizational order is an order by design. When order emerges, it does so through processes of self-organization. Pause here to read a brief excerpt from Stacy, Griffin, and Shaw discussing self-organization. The unanticipated, unplanned order created without centralized control or blueprint by processes of self-organization is frequently referred to as emergent order, though it has also been referred to as unorder by Kurtz and Snowden and disordered by Murray as a way of contrasting emergent order with that which is designed. Productive emergent order has been well documented during formal and informal responses to disasters and emergencies. When appropriate conditions are present, emergent order can be leveraged towards achieving positive outcomes. Self-organization is a prominent characteristic or behavior of complex systems. Complexity, like the term system, has also come to have many different meanings, so it is important to specify here which one this course is concerned with. Detail, computational, or combinatorial complexity is found in situations where there are a great deal of variables and the task is to select the optimal combination. The second type, the type this course is concerned with, is known as dynamic complexity, which arises from variables interacting with one another in such a way that the nature of the variables and the relationships among them continually changes. In dynamically complex situations, cause and effect relationships, patterns, and the most appropriate course of action are generally only apparent in hindsight. Change is constant and frequently unexpected. The nature of the future is uncertain. Relevant processes, variables, and relationships are too many to count, and the forming of concise descriptions or explanations of the past or present is difficult. Before proceeding, it is important to make a distinction between complex and complicated to bring greater clarity to the notion of complexity. To further clarify the difference between complicated and complex, pause here to read another quote discussing the difference between the two terms. Pause here to read two short quotes taken from the work of Paul Chiliers, who is renowned for his work with complex systems. Again, pause here to read two more excerpts from the work of Paul Chiliers that bring together the concepts of self-organization, systems, and complexity. So far, a number of concepts including systems, emergent properties, self-organization, and complexity have been introduced against the backdrop of the earlier conversation of neatness and messiness, or complexity, as it will now be referred to. The notion of dynamically complex systems that are continually changing as wholes due to ongoing processes of unplanned, undirected change among the system's parts that produce an emergent order should now be visible. The exploration of complex systems will continue as this lesson in the course progresses. Before moving further into the dynamics and characteristics of complex systems, the course will answer the question of, where do systems exist? Pause here to read a quote from the work of Stowell and Welch regarding seeing systems. So far, a number of concepts including systems, emergent properties, self-organization, and complexity have been introduced against the backdrop of the earlier conversation of neatness and messiness, or complexity, as it will now be referred to. The notion of dynamically complex systems that are continually changing as wholes due to ongoing processes of unplanned, undirected change among the system's parts that produce an emergent order should now be visible. The exploration of complex systems will continue as this lesson in the course progresses. Before moving further into the dynamics and characteristics of complex systems, the course will answer the question of, where do systems exist? Pause here to read a quote from the work of Stowell and Welch regarding seeing systems. In the last slide, Stowell and Welch aptly present seeing systems as a choice. Like any theory, the body of theory that can be placed under the umbrella term of complex systems presents a way of looking at the world. The advancement of science beginning in the 20th century and continuing today suggests that the notion of systems more accurately represents the world than older, mechanistic, reductionist science. If systems are recognized, the drawing of boundaries is identified throughout the literature as a key step in a process of effectively working with them, as expressed in the above quote, also by Stowell and Welch. Donella Meadows suggests that systems separated by boundaries do not really exist, adding that the world is only one system. However, this is too much to comprehend and work with. To make it manageable, the one system is divided by boundaries specific to a question being asked. Wherever a boundary is drawn, it is important to recognize the environment, everything considered to be outside of the system's boundary, is comprised of complex systems. The complex system or systems within the boundary are then not interacting with an environment they can exert unilateral control over, but a much larger array of complex systems. Interactions at the boundaries of systems are another source of dynamic complexity. Another important point can be made here. Systems have a network architecture as pictured here in the background. The network brings with it new assumptions of causality, further providing an alternative view to that of reductionism. As systems are networked, everything is connected to everything else, though these connections may not be direct. One part may be related to another part through a third part. While they do not directly connect, they share a common part that serves as a nexus between the two. As a result, in the words of John Sterman, a prominent figure in the systems narrative, everything is connected to everything else. You can't just do one thing. In a system, an action taken in one part reverberates throughout the remainder of the system in a nonlinear fashion. A consequence of networks and their imponderable number of interconnection and parts are nonlinear relationships. In nonlinear causal relationships, cause and effect are not proportionate or close in time and space. Further, in nonlinear causal relationships, lines of causality may not be clear, as more than one effect may be attributable to one cause and vice versa. Capra and Luisi suggest, as living organisms and humans can form an unbounded number of interconnections with the other organisms and humans, the resulting network of relations is nonlinear as it expands in all directions. Generally, an organism, such as a human, may not be aware of the total number of the other things they are connected to, which is where approaches such as social network analysis can be incredibly valuable. Now, boundaries, nonlinearity, and the network structure can be put together. Here, a boundary has been drawn and a small ecosystem, a portion of a larger ecosystem, is visible. Within the ecosystem, all processes and organisms are interconnected and interdependent. For example, a plant's uptake of nutrients provides food for an animal, which may then become food for another. The remnants of the animal then become food for other animals and insects before decomposing into the soil, where they will then be consumed by the plant. No matter what element is focused on in this image, it can be found that it is interconnected and interdependent to everything else. Consider the above quote from John Holland, found in his book titled Signals and Boundaries: Building Blocks for Complex Adaptive Systems. A shift in an ecosystem's dominant predator and food availability can have far-reaching effects on other populations within the ecosystem, and as a result, the ecosystem as a whole. As noted in the above, if the seal population decreases due to a change somewhere else in the ecosystem that has lowered the reproduction rate of seals, orcas may shift to eating otters. In turn, the otter population may then be lowered owed to this increased pressure. However, the lowering of the population does not occur in isolation, as the otter population will have interdependencies with many other organisms within its ecosystem. This is an example of nonlinearity. A change in the ecosystem, the decrease in the seal population, extends to all corners of the ecosystem as a whole. The effects may take place at a distance from the seals in terms of the ecosystem's food web, and manifest at a much later time. The subsequent orca shift to the otter and the following decrease in the otter population will not happen immediately. This is an example of nonlinear causal relationships, where cause and effect are often disproportionate and distant in time and space. At the same time, the above quote is also a demonstration of self-organization. The orcas were not directed toward the otter by a centralized control unit. As they shifted to the otters, a new order emerged within the ecosystem. When the seal population rebounds, the orcas are likely to shift back to the seals, changing the order within the ecosystem once more. If the decision is made to see them, systems are found everywhere. As they are encountered, systems are nested within other systems. For example, organizations are systems, as are the departments, teams, and individuals within them, and the informal social groups that arise among the various formally segmented work groups. A boundary can be drawn around the ecosystem pictured here, where all of the organisms and processes are interconnected and interdependent. At the same time, if the question being asked was about the fox, a boundary may be drawn around it. It would then be possible to refer to the fox as a system and its various organs as subsystems. Then the environment the fox was in could be considered a supra or meta system. This is all depending upon the question being asked. Earlier in the lesson, the gap between the impetus toward neatness and the messiness found in the world was discussed. In what followed, an attempt was made at introducing the beginning of the systems narrative that stands to help reduce this gap and better prepare for the complexity of the world. Complex systems can be found everywhere. They are dynamically complex and self-organizing, able to create their own order without centralized control. In complex systems, their structure and causal relationships are non-linear. Small changes, causes, can lead to disproportionate effects that may take place at a great distance from the cause and at a much later time. The system's view of life, as it is called by Fritjof Capra and many other adjoining narratives, work to embrace rather than reduce dynamic complexity. In closing, pause here to read an important excerpt from Capra's The Turning Point: Science, Society, and the Rising Culture.